Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishnah Yomi, Masechet Chagigah. We are up to Perek Bed Mishnah Daled. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilui Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayev and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden Amen and Avdi ben Chaim Chaim for the Refuah Shelemav Daniel Shalom ben Rosa Betoch Shah Chulei Israel. This Mishnah elaborates upon the dispute in the previous Mishnah as to whether the Olat Re'iyah may be brought on Yom Tov. The Mishnah begins at Atzeret Shechaliot Berev Shabbat, when Shavuot falls on a Friday. Bet Shammai Amrim Yom Tavoch Achar Shabbat. Bet Shammai say that the day of slaughtering the Olat Re'iyah is after Shabbat on Sunday, since this offering may not be brought on Yom Tov, as Bet Shammai maintained in the previous Mishnah. Or on Shabbat, as we explained earlier in chapter 1, Mishnah 6, the Olat Re'iyah, like the Chagigah, can be brought for 6 days after Shavuot. Bet Hillel omrim en yom tavoch achar Shabbat, but Bet Hillel say that there is no need for a day of slaughtering after Shabbat because the Olat Re'iyah is brought in Yom Tov itself, as Bet Hillel said in the previous Mishnah. Umodim shem chaliot b'Shabbat shem tavoch achar Shabbat. However, Bet Hillel agree that if Shavuot fell on Shabbat, the day of slaughtering, all the personal festival offerings after Shabbat on Sunday, because it is forbidden to bring any type of personal offering on Shabbat. The Torah permits slaughtering and offering on Shabbat only for the communal offerings required for that day. Now, when Shavuot falls on Shabbat and the festival offerings are slaughtered on Sunday, the following law applies on that Sunday. The Kohen Gadol may not wear his festival clothes. He does not wear his personal festival clothing when he is at home or outside. He does, however, wear his special priestly garments, which he must wear whenever he does avodah service in the temple. So the Kohen Gadol may not wear his festival clothing, and the people are permitted to eulogize the dead and to fast. These activities are prohibited on festive days. When a person brings an offering, he must normally treat that day as a festival, and he may not eulogize the dead or fast. On this day, however, these activities are permitted. We show that this Sunday is not a festival because we do not want to support the words of those who say that Shavuot always falls on the day after Shabbat, meaning Sunday. In the times of the Mishnah, the Tzedukim, a heretical group who rejected the oral Torah, concluded that Shavuot always falls on Sunday. They learned this from the verse that describes when Shavuot falls in Seder Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 15 and 16. Usfartem lechem imachrat Shabbat ad mochad Shabbat Shvi'it. You shall count for yourselves from the day after the Shabbat until the day after the seventh Shabbat. However, according to the oral teachings passed down from Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai, the Shabbat from which the count begins refers to the first day of Pesach, and the second Shabbat means week. So the verse teaches that Shavuot falls 7 weeks from the day after the first day of Pesach. The Tzedukim, however, who rejected this oral teaching, understood both Shabbatot as referring to the 7th day of the week. So in their opinion, the verse means that Shavuot is always the day after Shabbat, meaning Sunday. In the case of Shavuot falling on Shabbat, the sages were concerned that if the Sunday after Shavuot, when the Shavuot offerings are brought, is treated as the festival in any way, it might appear to be the actual Yom Tov of Shavuot, as the Tzedukim hold. It therefore required us to publicly treat that Sunday as an ordinary day to make it clear that it is not Shavuot. And that is the end of Mishnah Daled. We continue now with Mishnah Hey. From this Mishnah to the end of the tractate and the Masechet, the Tana discusses laws of Tumah and Tahara. The laws of Tumah and Tahara are not directly related to festival offerings, which is a subject of our tractate. Nevertheless, the Tana included these laws since a certain leniency in one of these laws of Tumah applies uniquely to the festival period. We will see in chapter 3, Mishnah 6. There wants the Mishnah to teach that law. It included many other laws of Tumah and Tahara as well. The Mishnah will explain how the laws of Tumah and Tahara differ for items of 5 different levels of holiness. The 5 levels are from the least holy to the most holy. Level 1, Chulin, ordinary food. Level 2, Maaser Sheni, the type that a farmer separates from his crop and eats in Yerushalayim. The Maaser discussed in this chapter refers to Maaser Sheni, which is a certain degree of holiness. Other types of Maaser, which are Maaser Rishon, which is awarded to the Levi, and Maaser Ani, which is given to the poor, are no holier than Chulin, and the laws of Tumah and Tahara that apply to Chulin apply to them as well. So when we say Maaser here, we are referring to the Maaser Sheni, the portion that is eaten in Yerushalayim. Level 3, Terumah, the portion of the crop given to a Kohen. Level 4, kodesh, sacrificial foods, such as the portions of sacrificial meat that are eaten. And level 5, mechatat, water mixed with the ashes of the parah adumah, used for purifying people and utensils who came into contact with the corpse. Water containing the ashes of the parah adumah, the red cow, was sprinkled on people or objects that had become tameh through contact with the corpse by following the procedures described in Bamidbar chapter 19, that they became tahol. This water is known as mechatat, chatat water, because the parah adumah is described in verse 9 there as a chatat. Chatat water should not be confused with the chatat offering, which has no greater holiness than any other sacrificial food. Aside from the biblical levels, the sages enacted different tumah and tahara rules for each level. In most instances, decrees enacted to protect the tahara of holier items were stricter than those enacted to protect less holy items. The several exceptions in this rule are discussed in chapter 3, Mishnah 4 through 6. The Mishnah begins by explaining how one purifies his hands from rabbinic tumah before dealing with items on each of the 5 levels. By rabbinic decree, stam yadayim, ordinary unrinsed hands, are considered tameh even when there is no evidence that they touch something tameh, as the Gemara says in Masechet Shabbat, page 14b through 15a. The reason for this decree is that a person often touches unclean parts of his body without realizing it, were he then to touch te'umar kodesh without first cleansing his hands, the holy food could become repulsive to people and would not be eaten. There are also a number of ways for hands to actually become tameh under rabbinic law. To ensure that anyone who planned on handling te'umar kodesh would cleanse his hands beforehand, the sages made a blanket decree that unrinsed hands must be purified before coming in contact with certain categories of food. This is true even with regard to handling chulin. They likewise decreed that hands become tameh under rabbinic law. If someone's hands touched a source of biblical tumah, however, his entire body certainly becomes tameh, and he must immerse in a mikveh to purify himself. Now the Mishnah describes the required method for purifying one's hands, which varies according to the degree of holiness of the foods with which he is involved. The food's degree of holiness also determines when purification is needed. A person must cleanse his hands before even handling foods with higher levels of holiness, but only before eating foods with a lower level of holiness, as the Rambam writes in his commentary to the Mishnah. The Mishnah begins, Nutlin layadayim lechulin ulmaaser v'litruma. We rinse our hands by pouring water from a cup over them in preparation for eating bread that is chulin, for eating bread or produce that is maaser sheni, or for handling tiruma. This is the rabbinic law known as netilat yadayim, which requires one to rinse his hands before handling certain types of food, even if he does not know that they touched anything tameh. For the purpose of chulin, maaser sheni, and tiruma, hand rinsing is sufficient. This involves pouring water over the hands from a cup containing at least a revi'it, a quarter log of water. Although hands that handle chulin, maaser sheni, and terumah foods are purified through hand rinsing, the 3 categories of foods are not treated the same. A person involved with chulin rinses his hands only before eating bread. With maaser sheni, which is holy, he must rinse his hands before eating bread or any food that is maaser sheni. And due to terumah's even higher level of holiness, the sages decreed tumah upon terumah, even if it was merely touched by unwashed hands. Therefore, a person must rinse his hands before he even touches any bread or produce that is tirumah. Ul kodesh matbilin, but when preparing our hands for eating kodesh, sacrificial food, we must immerse them in a mikveh, meaning rinsing them from a cup is not sufficient. Before eating kodesh foods, such as the eaten portions of chatat, asham, and shalim offerings, a person must immerse his hands in a mikveh. Even if he is not certain that they touch tumah, it is not enough for him to rinse his hands with a cup of water. Ulechatat, and before handling chatat water, namely water mixed with ashes of a parah adumah, the law is even more strict in that im nitmeu yadav nitma gufo. If one's hands become tameh under rabbinic law through touching a source of tumah, his entire body becomes tameh, and he must immerse himself in a mikveh in order to become ta'or, enough to handle chatat water. There are a number of ways to which hands can become tameh under rabbinic law, such as through touching food or liquids that are tameh, which cannot transmit tumah to people under biblical law, or through touching a scroll of scripture. If someone handling chatat water touched one of these things and made his hands tameh, he cannot purify them to rinsing or even by immersing them in a mikveh. Rather, he must immerse his entire body in order to become ta'or. If, however, a person's hands are tameh under the ordinary hands decree, but there is no evidence that he touched anything tameh, he may simply immerse his hands in a mikveh, just as for kodesh. And that is the Rabotai of today's Mishnah Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.